All right, so I'm sitting here with Damien Grant from Waterstone Insolvency. We're here to talk about COVID-19. We're here to talk about obligations as an employer and as a business owner, and also what can you do if you're a business owner and the business is struggling.
Thanks, Brent. So I think I'll start with your obligations, and I know that we actually have different views on this, but from my perspective, as a business owner, your first obligation is to your family. And I think a lot of business owners get lost in this, but as a breadwinner, as a husband or a wife, and as a parent, your first obligation is to your family. And I think a lot of company directors, they merge the corporate identity with their own identity. I mean, some people go so far as to put their own name on the building that they name the businesses after themselves. And the problem with that, which is a great thing to do. I mean, Henry Ford did it, and I think Norling Law is in a similar capacity in its innovation. But the problem with that is that as company directors, we can lose sight of the fact that our primary obligation isn't to the company, it's to our family. I think that's really important to remind people sometimes. But the secondary obligation then is to your staff. These are people who are spending time with you, you have made a commitment to them, and they have made, most importantly, a commitment to you. And so I think you have I know you have a moral obligation to the people who work for you. So you need to consider that. Then the next thing, from my perspective, which Brent disagrees with, is I think the next thing is you have an obligation to your creditors. Your creditors are people who have contracted with you and which your firm owes them money. So these are other business owners, some large, some small. They are effectively invested in your enterprise by giving you credit, and I think that you have a moral obligation to do the best by those individuals, by your creditors, and indeed if you don't, you'll come across somebody like me who might hold you to account. And then thirdly, there are your customers. So these are the people who you supply goods and services to, and you absolutely have a moral obligation to them, but I think that they come somewhat, in fact in my view, considerably below customers.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with you for most of that. I mean, I think family's important, and I think that's number one. And I agree with you. Business owners often muddle that, and they will then take risks that puts their own family livelihood at risk, which is often the type of clients that we see.
And often they don't tell their partners, particularly men. Men will take huge risks with their business and fail to tell their wives.
Yeah, and that's why often when there's a financial collapse, those marriages typically end. I mean, I don't know how many times I've seen that come out the end of the liquidation.
And it is really sad. So I guess the key thing is, if you're a wife and you think your husband is taking risks, ask to see the books now.
Yeah, we should be gender neutral. If you have a partner...
but it is typically men who take those risks.
It is.
Woman businesses fail, but they seem to be more prudent about it.
More communicative.
Yeah,
and then I also agree with you. There's a very strong moral obligation to staff, and they're definitely second. And I suppose from a legal perspective, creditors are definitely third on the list. And probably from a legal perspective, they're actually number one on the list, because if you don't look after your creditors, you've got some serious issues, and directors can be personally liable for unpaid creditors as well. So if you're talking legal, they're probably top of the list. But I suppose the reason why, from a business perspective, I'd put customers above creditors is, if you do a really good job for your customers, and you are customer centric, then you're probably going to be less likely to be in a position where you're going to have the creditors.
Yeah, but I mean, that's not true in the current environment. You can have treated your customers perfectly. COVID-19
yeah, that's
happens.
Right.
But mind you, do you think your perspective on that has changed by the nature of your business? I mean, you're a lawyer, you have a relationship with your clients that is maybe very different from the one that, say, Harvey Normans would have with their clients. Do you think that changes your perspective?
Possibly, but I mean, it's the Jeff...
I mean, you even called it sacred at one point.
Yeah, I suppose it's that, but it's also, I mean, you're right, my view is tainted by my solicitor-client relationship as well. But Jeff Bezos, that was his whole model: look after the customer first, and the money follows. And he doesn't have those kinds of obligations either. So I suppose it's really.
He
useful.
also forgot the first part of the obligations. The first person you have an obligation to is your family, and he made that mistake, and now he only owns half his business.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, she sounds like she deserves it. But
Anyway, we're going to move on.
Yeah, let's move on.
So now let's talk about your actual legal obligations. So let's talk about your legal obligations to your staff, particularly in a situation where we've suddenly found ourselves, you're running a good business, and suddenly, bang, your revenue has hit the wall. So what are your legal obligations to your staff in that situation?
Yeah, so look, right now in the COVID-19 space, there's going to be a lot of unusual scenarios that employers have to deal with, and leave issues is going to be up there at the top of the list. And when it comes to leave, employers need to have a really clear idea of the leave requirements that they have, as unpaid, paid, or annual leave, or salaries. And thankfully, for business owners, there's a package available from the taxpayers that will help support those staff that need to go on isolation at $585 a week. Versus full-time staff can have that support, and there's also health and safety. So
so what should an employer do in a situation where you've got somebody who comes back from overseas, or there's some other reason where you might have concerns? Are you legally obligated to stand that person down for 2 weeks?
Yeah, right now we're in an environment where there is isolation being imposed. So, if your employee comes back from Tahiti, the reality is they're going to have to go in isolation for 14 days at least before you allow them back into the workplace. Now, if they are able to work remotely, then the employer and employee are going to have to talk about how that's going to work and the logistics around that.
And practically speaking, you've got a big issue with productivity.
Yeah.
Yeah. The reality is that people working from home are less productive than people working in the office. And that's why we have offices, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's why we have all of the expense of putting people in one place. And anyone who says otherwise
has never run a business.
Either they're superhuman, they've never worked from home.
They don't have children or a dog.
Yeah, or Netflix. Because reality, one episode at lunchtime turns into 2. And people are just less productive at home, myself included. So there are all those obligations and logistics that are going to need to be worked through. But hey, look, there's also some benefits to working remotely. But
let's talk about redundancy, because again, we were talking before the camera started rolling about a couple of firms that we're aware of where they're running some fairly aggressive redundancy programs. So what should a firm do in that situation where they say, hey, we suddenly find ourselves, our revenue is down, we don't need as many staff?
So I know some practices are putting people on leave, so they're making them take their employment.
And can an employer do that?
Well, look, in certain circumstances, in a redundancy process, for example, these are our options, and if you get staff to buy into this, so it's their choice to take their annual leave now, and then to ride into a period of possible redundancies. It's a compromise between having to fire people now and just be able to push the can down the road to see if this dust settles, because for a lot of these businesses, especially in the tourism hospitality space, they do not have customers coming in the door. So is this temporary? Is next month, is it going to get better, or is this going to be a 12-month problem?
I think practically speaking, people who are currently affected by or anticipate that they actually need to have a redundancy plan set in place. And given the risk of getting it wrong, it's probably worth running that plan past somebody competent in employment law and say, look, this is what I'm going to do, because the issues you've got is how do you choose? If you've got 10 people doing the same job and you only need 3, how do you choose those 7? So you're going to need to have some form of objective measure that's going to protect you in the case that somebody takes a grievance. So I think that what I would have said that you need to come up with a plan, and then I think it's probably prudent to spend $1,000 running it past somebody who can give you some cover.
Yeah, I mean, I would say do it the other way around. Get the advice first, and do the planning stage with someone. But also,
the risk you face then is that the lawyer will write the plan for you and charge you more.
Well, this is
You
true,
need
but
to
at
be
least
careful with lawyers.
at least be a good plan.
Okay.
So look, I suppose the other thing to mention here is the taxpayer is put their
Chipping
hands in their pocket, and there is $585 available per employee for 12 weeks, and up to $150,000 per employer, where for staff and not for rent but for staff, and so don't necessarily need to rush. Some businesses don't necessarily need to rush to redundancy plans, but they need to have a plan now.
And $585 a week, that's somewhere between 70 and 30% of for most of your small business.
Yeah.
That's if you're paying somebody $50,000 a year, it's about half the wages.
Yeah, and so if you have a number of employees, you're still topping it up, and if you don't have customers coming in the door, it could still be a massive problem.
So you're in that situation where people and it's changed a lot in New Zealand. So when I first came here 30 years ago, the redundancy regime in most employers was really generous. You get something like 2 weeks for every year that you work there. Most small businesses don't have that. I think most small businesses that I've been involved in, they have somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks redundancy. And so I think that's a big factor. But business owners need to be looking at that information now, and they need to work out if they need to downsize. They need to work out what's going to be the cost of that process. And they need to work out what is going to be the cost of not running that process. Because that's, I think, let's talk about health and safety liability, because that's something that will be sitting in the back of people's minds at the moment.
Yeah. Well, it is an uncertain period, and a lot of employers will be unsure about how to handle their health and safety obligations, and particularly because, thank you, National. This is criminalised now. So if you get it wrong, you could go to prison. And
so if
that's not to fearmonger. People do go to prison for.
They do.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I suppose, look, having, from my perspective, kind of two things. You have to have a solid policy around this. So how you're going to handle staff that are sick or have sick family members, how you're going to handle staff that have travelled. The policy needs to be really clear, and then you need to practice it. So it needs to be in writing, and you need to practice it. It needs to be front of mind at all times. And look, here are...
And practically speaking, I think business owners need to kind of work together on this. So chances are, if you're a business owner, you know other business owners, it's probably worth ringing around and see somebody where that actually has a health and safety plan. And you don't want a health and safety plan just to be something that you've copied from somebody else, you put your logo on. You actually, because the advantage of doing a health and safety plan is that it forces you to actually think about, what would I actually do in this situation? And if you can show that you've got the plan and you've followed it and things still go wrong, then the chances are it's always at WorkSafe's discretion, because they're the people who prosecute their stuff. But if you can show that you've got a plan and things went wrong, that is a vastly different scenario from not having any plan. COVID-19 gets into your organisation, you've got a whole raft of issues, and not just the fact that you've got sick staff. You've then got WorkSafe potentially looking down over your shoulder. Yeah,
totally. And look, there are so many providers out there in New Zealand that will assist business owners with health and safety policies, and not at a large expense. And so, it's not something we do, but there are so many people out there that are available to help. And so, the message to business owners is, if you need help, you need to put your hand up. If you can't do it yourself, you need to put your hand up and get that assistance. So I suppose, what can you do in this kind of crisis as a business owner? We've covered off, staff taking leave and reducing staff. Another one is asking for payment holidays. So if if you owe money, to the landlord, to IRD, to other creditors, and you can't pay, look, my view is you turn that weakness into a strength. So you go to your landlord with your hands up, and you say, look, COVID-19 has affected us. We can't pay rent. We've been a really good tenant. Here's our payment history. We can't pay you. We need a rent holiday. Now,
and realistically, what's a landlord going to do in that situation?
Well, exactly.
What choices do they have?
Exactly. So if you've been a good tenant, what are they going to do? They could enforce their legal remedies. They could get you out of the building, and they could relet it.
Could they relet it though?
Well, they could try. Yeah, that's the point. And they could, most leases have personal guarantees, so they could go after the directors. And I think, given the way Kiwis run their companies, if the company fails, the director's probably not worth anything anyway. So, look, the landlord is going to be faced with an option of giving a 3-month holiday versus paying all the legal fees to evict, and then having an empty premises anyway. So, look, there could be some deals that can be done with landlords, and same with the IRD. So the government has given a solid steer to the IRD.
So you're talking about where Grant Robertson said in his stimulus package that he was giving the IRD discretion to waive interest and penalties where payment of tax was late due to COVID-19.
Yeah. I mean, and look, that discretion was already there, but there's a massive steer, and so I think there's going to be some ability to cut some deals with the IRD as well in relation to any overdue debts.
And look, the IRD is a government department with so much capacity. They will be having capacity issues like everybody else. People in self-quarantine, they are going to be inundated, practically speaking, with people in this situation. So there is a really good chance if you present the IRD with a good case, don't muck around, just put them with a good case, you've probably got a good chance that the IRD officer will look at that, and so long as you're telling the truth and it's kosher, you've got a good chance of getting over the line.
And look, my experience with the IRD is, I see clients that have made 1 to 2 page proposals to the IRD, and they've asked for the same thing that we ultimately asked for.
More likely to cut a deal,
and it's been declined.
Fully transparent,
and so tell a story. So tell a story, explain everything that's happened, go through why you are where you're at, put all your cards on the table, give them the support information they need. Give them your financials, give them your forecasts, and do that up front. You're more likely to get a rubber stamp straight away, rather than.
And I guess the other really important thing, when you're putting that presentation, as you said, to the IRD, and also potentially to your bank and to the landlord. But if you're sitting there and the numbers are not looking good, and you're thinking, I need to close my doors, you also need to remember that the IRD, the bank, the landlord, including your staff, they all have an investment in the business, right? So a lot of these people, they will want you to succeed. And if you don't ask them for support, you're not giving them the opportunity to give you the support. They might say no, but you need to ask the question. And this environment, because a lot of landlords are going to be suddenly find themselves in a situation, if they turn up the tap and they throw out the tenant, there's nothing. And I guess the same situation if you're a landlord. If you're a landlord watching this, you've got to consider the situation that this is a really uncertain time. You've had a good tenant, you potentially want that tenant to continue. It might be worth even proactively, if you know your tenants in hospitality, you drive past, you see there's nobody in there, maybe have a conversation with that tenant, because what you don't want is a tenant to throw in the towel thinking that they've been abandoned.
Yeah, and I suppose the worst thing you can do if you owe money is do nothing. The worst thing you can do is put your head in the sand, and that's what us Kiwis do, like most of the time.
Or go to Rarotonga.
Or go to Rarotonga and put it on Facebook and infuriate your creditors even more. I mean, that's what we do, right? So, and I suppose that kind of heading into the final stage of, if you can't plug some holes, if you can't get through this period, that final option.
Yeah, because remember, your creditors, the staff, the IRD, the bank, the landlord, they're all invested in your business. And so the chances are that at least some of them will want to step in and help you.
Yeah, and I suppose, look, if you get to that point and you can't resolve those issues, then one thing that needs to be considered is liquidation. So if you have debts mounting, if you can't pay those debts, if you can't see next month getting better, it's just, the reality is it's something that needs to be considered.
That you need to consider. But look,
Yeah.
we're not recommending that at the moment. We're just giving people options because I guess we also want to flatten the curve.
Mm.
So, all right, thanks very much, and we'll be back shortly.